you mentioned that you worked for Canonical. Is that where you learned about open source, or was that before then?
So I knew what open source was, I thought, because like many lawyers, particularly, I mean, we're talking sort of 16, 17 years ago, um, there was a standard clause that people would see in contracts, and it would either be an indemnity about the open source that you were distributing or a prohibition on it back then. So I kind of thought I knew what it was, and I could have given you a legal definition. I can't promise you that it would have said open source had to be on an OSI license, but it would definitely have said the source code was freely available. So I knew, I thought what it was, but I knew what a lawyer from the outside world thought it was. And I certainly didn't know, not so much that I didn't know, I was certainly very far away from what I learned it was within Canonical. And I had some really great teachers, some of them expected, some of them unexpected. So there's a guy called Matt Zimmerman. There's a guy called Matt Zimmerman, MDZ, who is in the Bay Area now, who was, critical in Debian and Ubuntu. And he was tasked with teaching me. So he used to sit me in a room and explain things. And I can remember in the first 6 months actually having a headache, which I never get, but I had a headache because I was trying to work out dynamic and static linking and the impact of what they called viral effect of copyleft licensing. And it was just like too much. And now it's something that, I wouldn't think twice about. And if somebody didn't understand it, I'd be confused that they didn't understand it. But it was tough. And it was tough partly because there was a lot to learn, but also in an environment like Canonical, it was the first place I'd ever been that had been engineer driven. So your CEO, your CFO, everybody around you comes from an engineering background, and normally law trumps, right?
Hmm.
Whatever environment you're in, if a lawyer says you can't do that, that's normally enough. And it wasn't that kind of environment. You really had to justify why, and you can't justify things if you don't understand them. So I really had to learn about this open source stuff and about communities. And I can remember panicking seeing things going out in the public in an open way because they weren't the kind of things a legal team would normally allow into the public domain, and basically being told to back off. And it was me that had to do the learning. And that sort of played out as being a learning about unlearning. So all the stuff that you're taught about control and management and protection as a lawyer to do well in a business and to manage a legal function well, you've sort of got to unlearn to transition into this modern world of collaboration. And that was
Yeah.
difficult for me sitting there all day, every day for 6 months. So I can only imagine when people are, they've got a busy workload and that's one of many, many different things they're looking at, how hard it is to really learn that. And I really try hard not to forget that. And then I also had some sort of acts of great kindness where there were a small group of lawyers. There was a Free Software Foundation Europe had a thing called the Legal Network, and the first event I went to had about 40 people at it in Amsterdam, and Shane Coughlin was the coordinator. He now runs Open Chain, and I think there were very few women, if I think back on it as well, but there were about 40 people. I think everybody was white as well, even worse. But there was a small group of lawyers there, a guy called Malcolm Bain in Spain, Andrew Katz in the UK, Carlo Piana in Italy, and they kind of took me under their wing and they helped me understand the legal issues. And Canonical enabled some funding for some stuff, and we did some projects. One of them was a risk grid that looked at contracts and looked at what you would do traditionally in a contract and how open source impact that, so in liabilities and indemnities and things. And I think Andrew Katz still keeps that up to date, something like version 14. But it was basically my learning tool for negotiation and understanding risk. So I was learning how legally people could or manage risk, and then I was learning from the people like Matt Zimmerman, Elmo, a bunch of people across open source, Colin King. There's a whole group of people who were just generally helping me in terms of understanding the open source and the community and how that all worked. And, John O'Bacon was our community manager in Canonical. So John was cutting his teeth in some ways as well. And it was a very collegiate environment. And in all honesty, it's also quite a neurodiverse environment. And it was the first place in my life I'd ever really felt at home. But I had this combination of people around me, in all honesty, largely male, but people around me who were supportive and trying to help me to become that general counsel that Canonical needed. And it was a really interesting experience,
And what year
very
was this again,
eye-opening.
Amanda? When did
That
you start
was
there?
February 2008.
Okay. So had the SCO thing mostly died down by then, or was it still going on?
Still going on, I think, but coming towards an end, if I
Right.
recall rightly. And we still had Grok
Yeah.
Grok would share what was going on in that sort of stuff. So that was a learning tool. But
What
you've
did
got
you
it.
think of Grok Law as far as it's such a I only ask because Grok Law was very unique, and I haven't seen it repeated to the level that it existed, right? As far as talk about a group of people that weren't necessarily developers coming together in force against a common foe. I mean,
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
shocking
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. It was all part of a learning of this thing that was just another world. And there was a piece there where when I joined, I had already been like head of legal and things, and I'd worked internationally since 2000. So I was used to the sort of, working with people from other cultures and things. But I had never experienced, obviously, anything quite like what I was going into. And I think that the environment, very collegiate, very helpful. But initially, the reason I worked in Canonical, in all honesty, is that I had cut my teeth in the dot-com boom by moving into a company called Dixon's, electrical retailers in the UK. We had 5 chains. It's much smaller today. We were the biggest seller of computers. We were talking about buying computers earlier. We were the biggest seller in Europe ahead of MediaMarkt of computers. And while I'd been there, I was there for 5 years too. I had done a lot of the computer buying, and we were shifting to doing it across the whole of Europe, and we'd internationalized while I was there, and I worked on that. So I did the computer buying for a while with the procurement team, and we had 2 OEM brands, own equipment manufacturer brands, Advent and Patriot. And those had enabled me to work with some of the suppliers in Asia who built OEM. And I'd worked with Apple as a supplier before Apple had stores, and all the different computer manufacturers back in the day. But what it meant was in Canonical, they were trying to work out how to put Ubuntu on Dell. And they were talking to other people, it's no secret now, it's all been done and dusted like HP and things back before HP split. But the big one was Dell, I think. And I joined, meant to be there for 3 months to scope out what they needed and then leave. And I was going to join Amazon, interestingly, to work on what I think would have been the Kindle, their first electrical retail product. And in the end, I didn't do that, and I stayed at Canonical. And I think they offered me the role within 6 weeks. And it wasn't because I was so brilliant, it was because I had understanding and knowledge of that OEM market that really helped in understanding the negotiations and just what you needed to do to make it work. So for me, the interaction of putting an OEM and putting Ubuntu on a desktop is largely why I ended up being the right person. At the same time, nobody expected me to get into open source. If you were to ask Shuttleworth, I don't know if he'll remember, but you could probably have knocked him over with a feather if you told him that this lawyer he brought in to do corporate commercial, run legal. I think it was always expected. And I brought somebody in to do licensing within 6 months because I didn't have the skills. But I think it was always expected that I would be sort of somebody sitting above that, doing the corporate commercial, and the open source people would be different. And it is probably one of the biggest things that happened in the whole of my life. Because when I look back on my career now, I've spent about 15 years working in open source, 5 years at Canonical, 2 years in a law firm afterwards, 4 or 5 years with Open UK. And then I've done bits and pieces around the community in between times when I've been in other roles. So there's 15, 16 years of my life. And also, I was a lawyer for 25 years. So 7 of those 25 years doing nothing but open source. So, that's like a third of my legal career, nearly a quarter to a third of my legal career. And then I guess I've worked for 30 years. So almost half of my entire career has been around open source. I can't code, you know, but it's just having that experience, having that engagement and interaction and finding somewhere I felt I fitted, which is probably quite straight. I doubt many women would have turned around and said, you know, I've joined this canonical Ubuntu crowd and I fit. Because when you look back on what it was at the time, I'm not sure if any of the core engineers were women. You know, when I look back, people like Alison Randall came in later,
Yeah.
who was obviously very involved in OpenStack as well. But I just don't, yeah, no, it was incredible, really.